The ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the most tragic and destructive in the modern history of the Middle East. While the current hostilities ignited in 2023, the origins of the struggle can be traced back to another war that occurred over a century ago.
When the First World War broke out in 1914, the land that is now Israel and Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. However, in 1917, the British Empire launched a campaign that would alter the course of history. This campaign involved fierce fighting in Gaza, dramatic cavalry charges, and even echoes of a modern crusade, ultimately laying the groundwork for a century of conflict.
By 1917, the Great War had been raging for 3 years with no end in sight. In Britain, many political figures, including Prime Minister David Lloyd George, were becoming disillusioned with the immense casualties and limited gains on the Western Front.
This led to a strategic divide among British leaders. The Westerners advocated for concentrating more troops in France to confront the primary enemy, Germany, while the Easterners, led by Lloyd George, pushed for an offensive against the more vulnerable Ottoman Empire.
Ottoman forces were spread thin across the Middle East, a region of crucial strategic importance to Britain due to the Suez Canal, its role in communicating with India, and its oil reserves. The Westerners dismissed this as a mere sideshow, but the Easterners' view ultimately prevailed, and the Middle Eastern Front took center stage.
London's military focus shifted to 2 regions, Palestine and Mesopotamia. Following Ottoman threats to the Suez Canal in 1915 and 1916, which British-led forces, including many Indian troops, successfully repelled, Britain was now ready to go on the offensive across the arid Sinai Desert.
In late 1916, British General Archibald Murray oversaw the construction of a railway line and water pipeline by the Egyptian Labor Corps, while the Egyptian Camel Transport Corps transported ammunition and supplies to the front. Britain also assembled the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, EEF, composed of British, Australian, New Zealand, West Indian, and Indian soldiers, supported by the Desert Column Cavalry and Imperial Camel Corps.
The Ottoman forces in the area were commanded by German General Friedrich Kress von Kressenstein and the governor of Ottoman Syria, Jamal Pasha. With German assistance, they built several rail extensions to fortify their defensive positions along the Gaza-Beersheba line, which protected Syria and the Levant. An Austro-Hungarian battery also reinforced their line. To reach the Gaza-Beersheba line, the British first had to retake the town of Rafah. On January 9, 1917, British-led cavalry and armored car units rapidly advanced on Ottoman trenches, dismounted, and carried out a successful assault. This victory opened the way for the Allied push into Palestine. As the British prepared, both sides engaged in aerial combat. The Germans and Ottomans had the advantage in the air, bombing the British water pipeline and tracking troop movements. As a result, when the British began their attack on Gaza on March 18th, the outnumbered Ottomans were prepared. Murray attempted a swift coup de main attack by sending mounted units to cut off the city from the north. And Anzac and British cavalry even breached the city's perimeter. However, the main ground assault faltered due to a dense fog, poor coordination between artillery and infantry, and confusion within the British command. Entrenched Ottoman defenders delivered effective fire on the British infantry advancing across open ground, even when some attacks initially succeeded. Quote, "Our great concern was a certain cactus hedge from which machine guns might wipe us all out as soon as we got level with it." Worn out and heavily laden, besides their packs, the men carried extra rations, a second water bottle, and extra bandoliers of ammunition. The prospect of having to rush the entrenched and steep slopes was not a pleasant one, but with bayonets fixed and revolvers cocked,
Off we went with a cheer. The Turks vacated their trenches and ran. The top of the hill was reached, and we rounded up many Turks. Hart, 568.
Commanders on both sides were unsure if they were winning the battle, but Murray was the first to concede. Fearing Ottoman reinforcements would arrive and trap his exposed cavalry, he ordered a retreat, much to the frustration of the Anzacs, who believed they were on the verge of capturing the city. The Ottomans secured a defensive victory, inflicting 4,000 casualties while suffering only 1,300. Murray, however, sent an overly optimistic and inaccurate report to London, exaggerating Ottoman losses. This was exactly the news Lloyd George wanted to hear, and he promptly ordered a second attack. After the First Battle of Gaza, the Ottomans received reinforcements while the British extended their railway line closer to the front. Once again, Ottoman and German aerial reconnaissance allowed them to monitor British preparations.
On April 17th, the next British attack commenced, and the Ottomans were ready. Murray's plan involved a flanking maneuver, but a lack of water sources forced the British to attack the strong Ottoman defenses mostly head-on. British warships and artillery supported the infantry and cavalry, along with several tanks.
However, the British struggled in the harsh desert conditions, and with too few tanks and heavy guns, the Ottoman positions proved too strong. Ottoman gunners easily destroyed the slow-moving tanks. Turkish artillery knocked out one of the tanks from a great distance, and it stopped. Our artillery fire forced the others to turn back, and only one got into the Turkish position. Turkish artillery took care of that one in our first trench line.
Heavy and precise Ottoman fire halted the British-led forces, causing 6,500 casualties, while the Ottomans suffered only 2,000. Lieutenant Broomfield's Scottish unit was particularly hard hit. Quote, "We were now under direct fire from a number of machine guns, rifles, Minenwerfers, and a battery of artillery. Nearly every man had been killed or wounded, and in spite of the additional danger of being rushed by the Turks, we were thankful as darkness fell when a few men crawled down a ditch to us and helped to hold the left of the hillside." End quote. Granger, 47.
On April 19, Murray called off the Second Battle of Gaza, a Central Powers victory that earned Kriegsmarschall von Kressenstein Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite.
While the Central Powers had halted the British advance in Palestine, the situation in Mesopotamia took a very different turn. The Ottomans had dealt a heavy blow to the British at Kut in 1916. But by 1917, the British had rebuilt their forces and replaced their leadership.
An army of 50,000 British and Indian troops advanced in December 1916, clashing with the Ottomans at Kut again in February. This time, the British were victorious, clearing the path to Baghdad and forcing the Ottomans to withdraw. The British entered the city on March 11, 1917, a victory that restored their prestige and damaged Ottoman morale.
The fall of Baghdad presented an opportunity for the British to advance their policy of reshaping the future Middle East. In 1916, they and the French had secretly agreed to divide the region under the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
However, they had also made a separate deal with the influential Hashemite family of Arabia. The Hashemites would lead Arab tribes in a revolt against the Turks in exchange for British support in establishing a future Arab kingdom. The British hoped to address the incompatibility of these two agreements after the war.
Just days after taking Baghdad, the British issued a proclamation to rally Arab support. Many noble Arabs have perished in the cause of Arab freedom at the hands of those alien rulers, the Turks, who oppress them. These noble Arabs shall not have suffered in vain.
Hashemite rebels soon achieved a significant victory that would draw them into the Palestine Campaign. British officer T.E. Lawrence spent early 1917 recruiting Bedouin tribes for the rebellion, and in July,
Hawittat tribesmen ambushed a small Ottoman force to seize the port town of Aqaba. Lawrence and 2 Arab guides then traveled 250 kilometers to Port Suez to inform the British, boosting morale after the Gaza failures and securing a major increase in gold subsidies for the Hashemites. As Lawrence made his journey to Egypt, the Ottomans were also undergoing changes. Jamal Pasha, the governor of Syria, reached out to the Hashemites, but no agreement was reached. The Army Command then created the Yildirim, or Lightning Bolt, Army Group, which was funded, equipped, and organized by the Germans. The troops even received stormtrooper training with the goal of retaking Baghdad. Former German commander Erich von Falkenhayn took command, but decided at a meeting with Ottoman commanders that the Palestine front was more critical than Baghdad, and the Yildirim should be deployed there instead. He and War Minister Enver Pasha wanted to go on the offensive, but Kress von Kressenstein and nearly all Ottoman generals, including Mustafa Kemal, opposed it. Falkenhayn considered Kress von Kressenstein too sympathetic to the Ottomans, even labeling him Verturkt, Turkified. In September, a frustrated Kemal, who commanded the 7th Army on the Sinai Front, sent a scathing report to Enver, with whom he had a difficult relationship. Kemal criticized the government's inaction in the face of famine in the Levant and made a bold prediction. Because of the weakness of the government, the country is in a state of anarchy. No one's rights can be protected. This causes the people to turn away from the government. Bribery and profiteering are rampant. If the war continues, the decaying state building will suddenly collapse one day.
Kemal went on to criticize the poor state of the army and what he perceived as Germany's disregard for Ottoman interests. Quote, "Such a way of dealing with the Germans is against the interests of our country. We are not so weak that we cannot decide for ourselves in this life and death war. If, for reasons unknown to me, it is necessary for the interests of our country that Falkenhayn should remain in command, the actual administration and rearward services should be left to a son of the country, a Muslim Turk."
Kemal threatened to resign if an offensive was ordered or if he had to continue serving under Falkenhayn. Enver responded that the Russian and expected Italian revolutions would soon turn the tide of the war.
So, while the British had captured Baghdad and the Arabs had taken Aqaba, the Germans and Ottomans were at odds over strategy. Palestine remained under Ottoman control, but the British were preparing for another assault. The British had failed in the first 2 Gaza battles despite their superior numbers and firepower, so the High Command replaced General Murray with the experienced General Edmund Allenby in June 1917. Allenby reorganized the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, boosted morale, and brought in fresh British troops from Salonika and new Bristol fighters to regain air superiority, despite French opposition. Allenby's new resources were part of a broader shift in Allied focus. The idea of capturing the Holy Land to protect civilization, as they saw it, had gained traction. British leaders also privately hoped that capturing Jerusalem would improve morale on the home front following a series of disasters in Russia, France, and Italy. Lloyd George even asked Allenby to deliver Jerusalem as a Christmas gift. The Third Battle of Gaza began on October 27, 1917, before the Central Powers had finished reorganizing their Yildirim army. British heavy guns and warships bombarded Ottoman positions around Gaza to deceive them into thinking the main attack would come there. However, the real target was the town of Beersheba, which contained most of the local water wells. Kress von Kressenstein had failed to reinforce the position before British, Indian, Australian, and New Zealand cavalry attacked. The Australian light horse captured the position in a charge that demonstrated the continuing value of cavalry in the Middle East. As Australian officer Murray Borcher noted, Owing to the volume of fire brought to bear from the enemy's position by machine guns and rifles, a dismounted attack would have resulted in a much greater number of casualties. It was noticed also that the morale of the enemy was greatly shaken through our troops galloping over his positions, thereby causing his riflemen and machine gunners to lose all control of fire discipline. When the troops came within short range of the trenches, the enemy seemed to direct almost all his fire at the horses.
The Australians then fought their way into the enemy trenches and drove out the remaining Ottomans with minimal resistance. Beersheba became a significant battle in Australian memory of the war.
With the water sources secured, the British launched their main attack on Gaza on November 6th after a series of feints. British-led forces pushed the Ottomans back in intense fighting. A whole heap of men and horses went down 20 or 30 yards from the muzzles of the Turkish guns. The squadron broke into a few scattered horsemen at the guns and then seemed to melt away completely. For a time, I, at any rate, had the impression that I was the only man left alive. I was amazed to discover we were the victors.
Kress von Kressenstein ordered a retreat and was subsequently dismissed by Falkenhayn. Ottoman forces managed to escape encirclement, but the British continued their advance, taking Jaffa without a fight on November 16. Ottoman troops made a final stand in the Judean hills on the route to Jerusalem, but were badly outnumbered and outgunned. The British had finally driven the Ottomans out of Gaza and were approaching the Holy City. Back in London, the government made a decision that would further complicate its post-war plans for the Middle East and dramatically impact history for more than a century.
The Zionist movement, which had existed since the 19th century, promoted the idea of a Jewish state. While several locations were considered, most Zionists, including Theodor Herzl, focused on Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jews and still home to a Jewish minority.
Even before the war, Zionist Jews had been immigrating to Palestine, which created tensions with the Arab majority. We are a nation threatened with disappearance by the Zionist tide in this Palestinian land, a nation which is threatened in its very being with expulsion from its homeland. Khalidi 26:27.
In 1917, the Allies were struggling to win the war, and Russia had withdrawn after the revolution. At the same time, some members of the British government, including Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour, were sympathetic to the Zionist cause, which was being lobbied for by prominent British Zionists like Chaim Weissman. London hoped that by supporting Zionism, the global Jewish diaspora might rally to the British cause.
Despite opposition from some British politicians like Lord Curzon and Edwin Montagu, who was Jewish but anti-Zionist, Balfour sent a telegram to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain in November 1917. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Mahler, 77.
This was a significant but ambiguous commitment. It was unclear whether national home meant a sovereign state and how the rights of the non-Jewish majority would be protected in practice. Britain had now entered into 3 contradictory agreements: to divide the Middle East with France, to create an independent Arab kingdom, and to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
However, what captured the headlines was Britain's march on Jerusalem. The hills surrounding the city were well suited for defense, and heavy rains had turned the narrow roads to mud. Allenby, wanting to spare the Holy City from battle, declared a 10-kilometer no-combat zone around it.
In fierce fighting from November 21, the British entered their self-declared no-combat zone, but failed to capture the villages north of the city to encircle the Ottomans. By December 8, they forced the Ottomans to withdraw, but again,
They were unable to encircle them. The Ottomans left Jerusalem undefended, and the British carefully orchestrated their entry. Unlike Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm, who had a section of the city's ancient walls demolished to ride in on horseback before the war, Allenby was more cautious, entering the city on foot through the Jaffa Gate on December 11. Muslim troops from British India were assigned to guard the Mosque of Omar to avoid offending local Muslims, many of whom reacted with caution. Many of the city's Christian and Jewish residents, as in Baghdad, were hopeful that the British arrival would improve their circumstances.
Some Allied newspapers, such as the New York Herald, ran headlines with references to both the past and future. Jerusalem is rescued by British after 673 years of Muslim rule. Great rejoicing in the Christian world. Jews everywhere, in particular, see the restoration of Palestine as part of Allies' program.
London asked British newspapers not to mention the Crusades to avoid offending the empire's millions of Muslim subjects, though some still referred to it as the Last Crusade. Even in secular France, priests sang a Te Deum at Notre Dame Cathedral.
For the Ottomans, the loss of Jerusalem was a heavy blow to morale. It was the third holiest city of Islam to be lost, following Mecca and Baghdad, with Medina still under siege by Arab rebels. Officer Fali Rifki Atay, who had been posted to Jerusalem in 1916 full of imperial pride, had a change in tone by December 1917. Inside the headquarters, the news "Jerusalem has fallen" spread like a death announcement. We started gathering up our tears for Beirut, Damascus, Aleppo. It was farewell to the empire and to all its hopes and dreams. The 1917 Palestine Campaign ended with a British victory, but the success of this so-called sideshow has been a subject of debate. Britain eventually committed 1.2 million troops to the Middle Eastern theater to fight one of the weakest Central Powers. Some historians argue that the Ottomans were already on the defensive and could not have threatened the Suez Canal, and that the victories in Palestine and Mesopotamia failed to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war.
Meanwhile, the British Army in Europe struggled to gain ground and ended the year lacking reinforcements that it might have had if the Westerners had gotten their way. The campaign also caused tensions between the Allies, as the French and Italians wanted a role in the symbolically important Holy Land, but Allenby excluded them.
Defenders of the campaign argue that it protected Britain's interests in the region and in India, and provided much-needed victories during a difficult period. What is certain is that the British conquest of Ottoman Palestine had a profound impact on the future of the Middle East.
In December 1917, Lloyd George predicted that this campaign would hold a prominent place in future histories. The British Empire owes a great deal to sideshows. I have no doubt at all that when the history of 1917 comes to be written and comes to be read ages hence, these events in Mesopotamia and Palestine will hold a much more conspicuous place in the minds and the memories of people than many an event which looms much larger for the moment in our sight.
The Prime Minister could not have known how correct he was. After the war, London received a mandate from the League of Nations to oversee Palestine, and it incorporated the Balfour Declaration, allowing Jewish settlement and paving the way for the establishment of modern Israel and a conflict that continues to this day.
This wasn't the only way that the year 1917 echoed through the 20th century. At the end of the year, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and would later emerge victorious from the Russian Civil War with the young Joseph Stalin at the helm. The newly formed Soviet Union would go on to play a critical role in the following decades, standing at the gates of Berlin in the next World War and developing its own nuclear weapon by 1945.